Welcome to the Planning Commission meeting for October 18th, 2022. Kathy, please call the roll.
Chair Finch,
Here.
Commissioner Lavra, Commissioner Yanasak,
Here.
Commissioner Zielinski,
Here.
Commissioner McGinn,
Here.
Commissioner Chatters. Here. Commissioner Ballard,
Here.
Commissioner Atkins.
Here.
Thank you.
To those of you in the room, welcome back. Nice to see you today. To those of you joining us remotely, please mute your microphone, or if you are calling in, mute your phone by pressing *6. If you are participating remotely and would like to provide public comments, unmute your microphone. If you are calling in, unmute your phone by pressing *6. After you provide comment, please mute your microphone or your phone. Item 2, approval of minutes for the October 4, 2022 meeting.
I move that we approve the minutes for October 4th.
Thank you. Do I have a second?
I'll second that.
Thank you.
Commissioner Ballard,
Aye.
Commissioner Chatters,
Yes.
Commissioner McGinn,
Yes.
Commissioner Zielinski,
Yes.
Commissioner Yanasak,
Yes.
Commissioner Lavra,
Yes.
Chair Finch.
Yes.
Thank you.
Item 3, reports of members and committees. Any commissioner reports this evening?
Just an accolade for the city. I had the privilege of going through the, shoot, I've lost the, it's the ULI awarded the excellence for, is it? No, the New Housing, or New Hope? The New Hope Center. I'm sorry?
Is that Housing Hope?
Yes, Housing Hope, thank you. So New Hope, that building, I didn't realize that that was a platinum LEED project. It's the only one in the city. In fact, in the way they've done it, actually for it being with residents, I think it might be one of the only ones in the state. So it was quite incredible. If you haven't seen it, the arrays are amazing up on top. Still struggling with trying to make it exactly positive, but they're getting closer and a lot of lessons learned. But it was pretty cool, and it was led by a large team, but certainly Dykeman, a local company, was also present in that leading of it. So
That's great. And the location, is this the project on Broadway?
yes, it is.
Great. Yep. Perfect. Any other reports or comments? Okay, great. Staff comments.
Good evening, Planning Commissioner. I'm Yorick Stevens-Wajda, Planning Director for the city, and here with me this evening is Becky McCrary, Long Range Planning Manager, Kelsey Hyde, Planner, and Steve Inglesby, Land Use Planning Manager, who will help us out with the main item on to a couple weeks ago. I thought we had a fantastic discussion about the Baker Heights redevelopment into the Park District. I want to thank the Everett Housing Authority folks and the consultant team for coming to give that early briefing. They heard you on one aspect, which was a couple of commissioners, I think, mentioned that they would like to learn more about the Housing Authority and its work and maybe some of its portfolio of properties and everything. They have offered to conduct a tour of Everett Housing Authority properties that would be accompanied by probably a lot of discussion about their work and their strategic plan and their mission and all of that. Their offer was to do this sometime in November during daylight hours. So this might take some scheduling gymnastics to get that on the calendar for at least as many of you that could make it. And I think staff will join this and we'll learn a lot from it too. Because the more the merrier. The planning committee of the city council, which is council members Fossey, Vogely, and Zarlingo, we had been talking to them, meet with them about monthly to quarterly, and they had asked about doing a tour a couple of months ago, and we had been working on what could be a potential itinerary for that, and this jumped out and provided potentially a good one. So our thought was to maybe schedule in November a joint tour between the Planning Commission and the City Council Planning Committee, hosted by the Housing Authority, and focusing probably on that Baker Heights as an important piece of their work, but also branching out into the rest of the work that they do. So look for some communications from us about how we can schedule that. It is November 1 to 16 or 21 to 29 from the Housing Authority's side. So we'll whittle it down to there and see if we can find any hour or hour and a half chunk to fit all of our schedules. Speaking of the council, we have a briefing to the council tomorrow on efforts of the Everett Station District Alliance around planning for the Everett Station District. We will be talking through some recent efforts that the Alliance has been done about developing a leadership collaborative and a structure to advance the recommendations that are in the convergence study that was completed a couple of years ago by the Everett Station District Alliance and some partners, including and funded by the Department of Commerce. So look forward to that discussion with the council. And I guess it's Everett Station District Week because on Friday we have a walking tour. This is put together by the Puget Sound Regional Council. They have a series of transit-oriented development walking tours, and they're coming to downtown Everett or to the Everett Station District on Friday. So we'll be leading a tour of about 30 folks from around the region of that area and talking about some of the planning, the interesting planning work that is going on and that is to come. We've continued to advance our comprehensive plan periodic update. We actually just today had a work session on middle housing, and that's connected to the periodic update, but also a grant work program that I've mentioned a couple times here before. We actually had, for the first time, we met with the technical assistance staff team from the Department of Commerce, which is helping out cities around the state who are working on middle housing grants and work programs. There's a tie-in, I think, to our discussion on accessory dwelling units today as we were turning concept into proposed specific language. There was a thread that kept running through our minds about the next step. One example is what is an accessory dwelling unit in a context where maybe duplexes and triplexes are already allowed, and does that start to change what it is, or maybe there are certain areas that are appropriate for accessory units but not some of those other middle housing units. But all of these questions that we'll dive into shortly around setbacks and heights and everything all seemed just as applicable to the middle housing discussions that we're going to have to roll our sleeves up and dive into here fairly soon. That was also connected to developing or crystallizing around our alternatives that we'll study in the environmental impact statement. You've heard about those numerous times through this process, the no action alternative and the concentrated and dispersed alternative, the dispersed one being mainly focused on a middle housing kind of a scheme. So we made some good progress there, and I think are pretty close to nailing down some specific alternatives that we will then shop around, including to the Planning Commission. So great progress there. Excited to see that moving forward to hopefully kind of the next big step. I know we've all been waiting for it to move from the scoping phase to kind of the next real analysis phase. And then the Housing Action Plan Implementation, or HAPPY, grant work program has been advancing happily along. We've got finally some of the first work products have come out of the consultant team there. Some draft memos around, let's see, what was it? Multifamily tax exemption performance, height and bonus density performance. Spoiler alert, nobody has used them yet. And they're developing a list of potential incentives to recommend that the city pursue in the future. And I think, what was the other draft memo, Rachel?
waivers.
Fee waivers, yes, fee waivers. And then riffing off the fee waivers bit, we were, I gotta say, I was a little bit surprised. We were successful in receiving a grant from the Department of Commerce for $1 million to support the Four Corners affordable housing development at Evergreen Way, just north of the Boeing Freeway on the old Kmart site there. And that $1 million is going to defray the utility extension costs associated with that development. And in return, there is a long-term affordable component required of the development. So that's exciting news, and we'll be developing a quick ordinance to the fee waiver ordinance had sunset, the one that gives us the authority to waive fees for affordable housing developments. So in the meantime, the consultants are going to develop probably a new one based on their recommendations that applies citywide. But in the meantime, we're going to do a short ordinance focused only on that development to be able to receive and apply that grant. Lastly, there are 4 meeting slots left in the year. Traditionally, we meet on the 3rd Tuesday of every month. There are 2 of those, and then we reserve the 1st Tuesday of the month for a potential second meeting. The 4 dates that we have left are November 1st, 15th, 6th, and December 6th and December 20th. Don't have to come to conclusion on this here, but I think staff sees the capacity for about 2 meetings out of that bunch. So I think we could keep it at the November 15 and December 20 if we wanted to. December 20 is getting pretty close to holiday season, so we could look at something like either November 1 and 15 or November 15 and December 6. But just wanted to throw that out there for your consideration, and maybe we'll wrap both of those questions up into one scheduling email that we can send out to all of you, and hopefully come to a schedule for the rest of the year. Can't believe it's already here. That's it for me. Thank you. And as always, if you have any questions on any topic, happy to do my best.
Any questions? Thank you, York. Kathy, do we have any public waiting remotely? Not tonight. Okay. Any public comment on matters that are not being addressed in the agenda tonight? Okay, great. York, I think you're up again.
Okay, we must be at the accessory dwelling units action item. So we brought accessory dwelling units to you in its conceptual form back in March, and we covered some of the policy guidance, some of the recent changes that the city has done around accessory dwelling units. I think some of the bills come out of the state legislature, and then ended with a tour of some recent development that we've seen in terms of accessory units around the city, and a list of potential regulations that we might propose to change later on. We've been working on this since March, off and on, juggling our other projects, and have gotten to the point where we've got some actual proposed strike-through language for your consideration today. So I'm going to kick it off with, I think it's worth, maybe not at every meeting, but at least if it's been like 6 months since we last touched on this topic, to talk, to kind of go back to the reason that we're doing this. And it may be obvious to some, or you hear accessory dwelling units at every turn. I know I get calls at least weekly from people who are interested in building accessory dwelling units and who are asking me when this ordinance is going to be passed, and that extended to just today. I got one from someone who wasn't even aware that I had a planning commission. I said, boy, I've got good news for you on that front. We're making progress anyways. So I'll cover just a little bit of the policy guidance as a reminder of why we're here, and then Becky will take it away with our proposal. So under state law, a couple of years ago, there was a bill that passed. It was started as a mandate that would have required a certain number of a long menu of housing supply and choice actions be taken by cities. Through the legislative process, that got whittled down to encouragement, along with grant funding and protection from some certain types of appeals. But it's a good statement of legislative intent, and very recent, around housing. And letters N, O, P, Q, and X all dealt with affordable housing, and so that's one of the pieces of policy guidance that we're working on implementing here. Vision 2050, the regional plan over the 4-county King, Pierce, Snohomish, and Kitsap County region, has a number of housing policies, including providing a range of housing types and choices, achieving and sustain a sufficient supply of housing to meet the needs of low, moderate, middle income, and special needs individuals and households, expanding housing capacity for moderate density housing to bridge the gap between single family and more intensive multifamily developments. It's got accessory dwelling units and middle housing written all over it. And then encouraging broadly jurisdictions to review and streamline development standards and regulations to advance their public benefit, provide flexibility, and minimize additional costs to housing. I think it's worth noting as I go through all of these that the work that went into these policies, these are not just words that kind of tumbled out in an afternoon of work. This was workshopped over years and poured over by boards and commissions and ultimately the General Assembly of the entire region, representatives from all 86 cities and counties. So I think these words are worth reading closely and paying particular heed to, because it's something that a lot of people worked on and got to solid agreement on. There's a regional housing strategy that was adopted earlier this year at the regional level, and one of the actions in there, I think it focuses on 3 major pillars: supply. Oh, I shouldn't have started that. I'm not going to remember all 3 of them. Supply, subsidy, they're all S's. And we'll see. Next meeting, I'll fill that out again. But reform single-family zoning to increase opportunities for, among other things, accessory dwelling units. Our own comprehensive plan, that's a lot of words there, but we can distill it down to promote a wide variety of choices for safe and decent housing for all, promote housing alternatives to the large lot single-family detached dwellings and large footprint apartment complexes, and accommodate well-designed infill housing that protects the character of the neighborhoods. And then finally, probably most connected to why we're here right now, is the Rethink Housing Action Plan. Was adopted late last year by the City Council. A lot of work went into that by Planning Commission, staff, other boards and commissions in the council. The very first recommendation in the whole Housing Action Plan, and it's a short-term recommendation, is to promote accessory dwelling unit development through changes to regulations and processes. So if you're sensing a theme here, I've definitely sensed it, and I think I could have gone for 10 more slides if I had gone shopping for more countywide planning policies, the housing affordability regional task force had an action around accessory dwelling units. So it is definitely one of the major initiatives that is being called for in housing action plans all over the place. So we took all of that to heart, and I will turn it to Becky to walk us through how we propose to implement all of that I just went through.
Great, thank you. Becky McCrary, Long Range Planning Manager, thank you. And I will apologize because I'm still recovering with my voice, but I think I can get through it here tonight. What you're looking at here is a dashboard that we hope to create and put on our website about ADUs. Our GIS specialists put this together, but this is the information that you have on the map that's in your memo, and it's showing that since we adopted the new code in 2020, then December, that we've had 31 permitted accessory dwelling units. You'll notice that there have been some in the south, some in the north. We're not done with 2022, but in 2021 we had, I can't read it because it's so small, but it looks like 16. And so we would like to continue to keep track of this, not only this, but maybe some of the other interesting statistics about the ADUs that we're permitting. Next slide. So as York mentioned, we were here with you in March, and we covered a number of topics that we've seen have been issued. We have had our land use staff working with this code since December of 20, and they've identified a number of issues with the code too. So we were able to roll in some of those amendments to help with processing permits along with some of the other proposals. Next slide. So I'll start out with that ADUs are permitted in all our zones except for heavy industrial and our mixed urban zone. Go ahead. So the yellow, I guess, go back real quick, sorry about that. So the yellow is our single-family zones, the brown color are our multifamily zones. Purples are our industrial, you can see the light and the dark, that's heavy and light. And then our red zones are our mixed urban.
Red is business.
I'm sorry, business, the pink is mixed urban, yes, got that backwards. Just along our arterials, corridors. So we started with the definition, and in order to streamline and make it as simple and consistent as possible, we decided to propose a new definition. The current definition distinguishes between attached and detached, and that's because there were different regulations for either attached or detached in some cases. We've proposed a definition that encompasses both detached and attached, and it describes what an accessory dwelling unit is, which is subordinate to the principal unit. So we feel like that captures what an accessory unit is. Next slide. So there you see the actual code language that we are proposing. It's shorter, and again, as I mentioned, it will cover So I would just want to make a clarification. So it's subordinate to a permitted principal dwelling unit or units, and the reason for units is that they are allowed in our multifamily zone, so it could be on a lot with multifamily. Next slide. So next we'll cover lot size, number of units, and density that we're proposing. And so we were proposing to increase the number of ADUs per lot from 1 to 2. And the comment or note that I would make there is that you still have to meet all the other lot coverage requirements. You would need to meet the parking standards. You would have to meet all of those other requirements. So if you had a large enough lot, you could fit a couple of units, those smaller units on there. There has been currently no lot size limit, and we're not proposing to change that. In the UR4 zone, there was a note that required that the ADU would need to be included in your density calculations, and so it isn't in any other zone, and if there's room to fit an accessory unit, it seems like it would be appropriate. And so we've proposed to remove that from the density calculations. And then there is no change, again, to the lot coverage. I want to make a short note here in that ADUs can get an additional 5% of lot coverage to get the unit on there. We have added that the primary structure has got to be in place or be in existence for at least 3 years. And that's to prevent some things that we've seen occurring where people are coming in and doing the accessory unit with their principal unit up front just to get the 5%. So we figure if it's been permitted for a while, then it's established and it would be appropriate. Next slide.
I just wanted to highlight one thing about that third bullet there, removing the minimum density provision. Every time I read it, whenever I see density, I'm used to seeing maximum density. And that trips me up all the time. So I just wanted to flag that this is in the use matrix. There's a reference note 5 in these code amendments handout. You see it on that front page. Allowed if meeting the minimum density requirements. And that minimum density is 3, I believe, for the UR4 zone. And correct me if I'm wrong, but we've been challenged to implement that. So if I have one house in the UR4 zone, does that mean I cannot add an accessory dwelling unit because 1 + 1 is 2 and 2 isn't 3? But normally, when there's a non-conforming situation, which a single unit that is under density would be, we allow actions that get us closer to conformity, and so 2 is closer to 3 than 1. So we just have not been able to figure out exactly how to implement that. it doesn't seem correct to prohibit an accessory dwelling unit being added to a house. So I just wanted to flag that because I get confused all the time. Speaking of confused.
So here, we took the opportunity to simplify the code. There, you can see there was a formula that was used to figure out how large your accessory dwelling unit could be. And in no case should it be more than 1,000 square feet. So we're proposing just to make the maximum size, in any case, 1,000 square feet. Again, you still have to meet lot coverage and all of the other requirements on your site. So that could be the more limiting factor than some of those other things. And in the UR4, UR3 zones and our commercial zones, there is no size limit. Next slide.
Which is interesting, and so I guess we would be establishing a size limit for those zones for an accessory dwelling unit. I'm not sure if that was on purpose to have that left off.
Let me not finish on this. I'm not finished on this one. There have been instances where someone, say, wanted to have an ADU in their basement, and maybe their basement is greater than 1,000 square feet, or whatever the calculation was there. And so we're suggesting removing that because it might not make sense structurally to limit that size. And it's already within a dwelling unit. So, again, we're holding the 3 years, must be in existence for 3 years, but it could exceed that 1,000 square foot limit if it was totally enclosed in an existing structure.
Question for you on that.
Yeah.
So does that mean, I guess by default, that this would make duplexes possible anywhere? I think it's fine, I don't have a problem with it, but I think what we're doing is we're backing into calling a otherwise single-family home possibly a duplex. And I think previously that wasn't allowed in all R zones, is that correct?
Duplexes are allowed in
That
R1.
They're permitted in R1 if you have a minimum of 12,000 square feet of lot area, and they're permitted in R2 if you have a minimum of 7,500 square feet of lot area. I think with this particular size limitation, it has come up several times. I work with a lot of people at the counter processing permits, and they constantly are asking why they can't just convert. Maybe they've got 1,100 square feet, and then they're limited to 1,000. It's like, okay, well, how do we knock out 100 square feet from an area that, at least from, the public, no one would know the difference either way. And I would add to at least this limitation, or not limitation, but this 3-year requirement actually was previously in the code and got taken out with rethink. And I think it's important to note that because I don't know if it was intentional to be taken out from the beginning. And certainly because it's a question we get a lot, it would be nice to put back in.
I mean, I think this new language makes sense. I just wanted to make sure I was reading it correctly.
Yeah. Okay.
Can I ask a quick question while we're on
Sure.
the 3-year thing? Can you just help me understand that particular requirement, the 3-year requirement? You mentioned something. Could you repeat what you said about why that is necessary?
So I think if someone came in and wanted to build the primary unit and the accessory unit at the same time, that feels more like a duplex situation in a way. And this establishes the primary unit first.
Okay, so it is
Yeah,
a
go.
deliberate decision to disallow the building of an ADU along with a primary residence?
over 1,000 square feet.
Over 1,000 square feet.
Okay,
So maybe a situation would be a 1,500 feet, 2 levels, and you call one an ADU, that's bigger than we allow for an ADU.
okay.
And so it would, you would have to, in the case that Kelsey mentioned, if you had an 1,100 square foot floor that, in a house that you already have and you want to convert that to an ADU, you could, but we wouldn't want to allow people to kind of skirt into a bigger ADU.
You'd also
Because it goes back to
mentioned-
the lot coverage too, which
Yeah.
we require the existing square foot. So
Okay.
in effect, that's what it does
I guess
intentionally.
another way to get at the same outcome relative to the lot coverage bonus would be to prohibit that bonus to apply to structures that are newer than 3 years old. Right, so it reduces the use of that bonus, but it also provides for a larger ADU and a new construction.
I do like that solution because it does seem to push the immediacy of the issue. We are trying to allow people to build these ADUs, but, you know, within certain parameters. So that sort of hits that.
I agree, because I think that I guess if I am a resident and I am wanting to have, I know ultimately I want an ADU, it would seem odd to me as a layperson, as a resident, to be prohibited from building that along with the primary structure when I already have this major construction project going on. So I do like that suggestion.
And taking out a loan for new construction as well with the intention of doing the project in completion, I think that that does seem fair.
Could you restate what that alternative?
And I may be getting this wrong,
Yeah.
but what I understood earlier was that the challenge was the abuse of the lot coverage bonus in constructing a new structure with an ADU. That's what I thought the concern was. I don't have a problem with a new structure
Because that's.
that doesn't have a limitation on the size of the ADU.
the main
Does that make
proposed-
sense?
Yeah.
I think it makes sense to Becky, that's good to know.
Does it make sense to you?
I'm thinking of this in the context of you only allow
Yeah.
1,000 square feet as the maximum size to be an ADU, but we wanted to provide a pathway for existing house that has a floor that's 1,100 square feet to be able to turn that whole floor without doing shenanigans like saying this little piece isn't part of the ADU or something. If you just allowed no size limit, then there would be no size limit at any time, but if you wanted to build a 1,000 square foot or below accessory dwelling unit at the same time as you're building a house, whether attached or detached, there would be no problem with that. Only a over 1,000 square foot.
Right, and I guess,
Yeah.
one example could be creating a separate living unit for an elderly parent or unrelated person in the same structure that was 1,200 feet a level. It would be odd to have to shave that down by 200 feet just to construct that building.
Yeah.
I guess, can I, I'm kind of still kind of confused on that. I mean, if someone did want to come in and do this, would there be anything prohibiting them from just building the structure and maybe leaving an opening for a staircase or something and then just closing it up in 3 years and saying, now I've got an ADU? I mean, so in some ways it seems like there's pretty easy workarounds for someone who was determined to do that, so it almost seems kind of,
I'm not proposing a limitation on square footage.
yeah, and I guess I'm still confused about, I guess maybe I'm just trying to figure out what the evil is that is trying, or the evil is trying to be avoided.
Well, I agree with that.
Yeah.
I'm not, I guess it would be great to have an example as to why the use of the bonus was detrimental. There's a 5% lot coverage bonus, as I understand it. Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I guess that's the first question is, why is that detrimental?
I mean, in some ways, if someone is willing to do that and use this, what they're gonna use for one family, potentially for two, that's kind of the spirit of the policy, isn't it? We're trying to increase housing options, housing stock, so should that really be discouraged? On kind of what I would kind of see maybe somewhat a technical timing issue. Why make them wait 3 years to do it?
Well, right now, you can't do it at all. So right now, we have a limit of 1,000 square feet. If you're under a 6,600 square foot lot, then you're limited even further to 900, 800, 700.
Yeah.
If your existing primary dwelling is less than 1,000 square feet, there aren't many, but there are some, you would be limited further. And so we're upping the maximum to 1,000 square feet in all cases, which would be an increase from the 500. But why the challenge with, why is it wrong to have a larger than 1,000 square foot accessory dwelling unit? I think that comes back partially to what is the niche role for accessory dwelling units. It is generally smaller. The bigger they are, the more bulk they have. You would still need to meet setbacks, lot coverage, height restrictions and all that, so maybe that is enough. I think some developers have looked for larger units, but at 1,500, 1,200, 1,300, it's like, that's kind of a house at that point. That's not an accessory dwelling unit anymore. And then back to my earlier comment on how this starts to blend in a little bit with the middle housing. In many if the lot is big enough, you can build a duplex, and then that is big enough, and then soon we're gonna be having a conversation about not just an accessory dwelling unit on that lot, but a duplex of any size, or a triplex or whatnot. So in terms of why 1,000 square feet I mean, that's a fairly common middle ground of maximum sizes that I've seen, and I think in the people's general perception based on the overall size distribution of houses, 1,000 square feet is around that upper limit of what feels like a small scale development that would fit in well.
I think that I see where you're going, because you don't want to bleed over into being a duplex and really blurring that line between defining an ADU with a primary unit versus a duplex. I think that the thing that strikes me as problematic is the 3-year time frame. And Becky, you mentioned that there is no real material impact on the community outside of the house. When there is an accessory dwelling unit contained within it that is, it's a little over that 1,000 square feet. So I think it's the time frame thing that's causing me to just have a little bit of a pause, not necessarily having a limit to what constitutes an ADU as part of an existing structure.
So the commission might entertain a larger maximum size for ADUs, or a longer, because we're trying to differentiate new construction from a remodel, essentially. We're saying if it's new construction, you're limited to 1,000. If it is remodeling an existing structure within that, we recognize that that may be different sizes, and we want to give a little bit of wiggle room, because you're not going to rebuild the house. You don't want to shave off pieces of it. So that was the thinking of that, but if the 1,000 square feet feels small, we can kind of do a little bit more homework around that. And, yeah.
I think my issue was the time period. So I think the first bullet, maximum size of 1,000 square feet, I didn't take an issue with that. The part I'm having a hard time understanding the justification for is the second part of the second bullet. And so we could probably end that bullet after existing dwelling, from my opinion.
Okay.
I would agree
Does
with that.
that seem to the folks who, so we would interpret that, I think, that if you permitted a new construction 2,400 square foot 2-level structure, and then the next month or the next day, you said, okay, now that bottom floor, I'm gonna make an accessory dwelling unit, 1,200 square feet, then we would approve that. And obviously, they wouldn't have been allowed to build it in a different way, but.
Well, I think that, I guess from my perspective, and again, you guys have seen this in practice, so, please describe the downfalls to this, but it strikes me that anybody who's constructing that residential structure, they're already doing it per code. right? So it's already consistent with the standards we've set for any other lot. I just don't see the reason to hold it off the market for 3 years, that's all.
Well, I guess what if they were gonna build this 2,400 square foot house and top floor 1,200 square feet and the bottom floor, what if they called it 600 square foot ADUs? Then they wouldn't have to apply to this whole thing anyway, right?
That's true.
I mean, it just seems like there's a number of ways that someone who was clever could think about getting around that anyway.
That is clever, although we would get another housing unit out of it, which is valuable.
Gotta find a place to park.
Yeah, yeah.
But good, yeah, fantastic. This is exactly what we need. And we'll, I think we could make it work to drop the 3-year. But we'll run them through all of our use cases.
I guess I would just say though too, I can also see why then essentially they're building a triplex
Yeah.
in a place where that's not. So there, I can see why there's a problem, but it almost seems like there's a problem somewhat either way. And I don't know what the solution is, but you've got, either way raises, I think, legitimate issues.
Well, yes, I mean, I think that, because I don't have a significant issue with that because the building itself conforms to the required standards. There will be a point in this discussion, I'm sure, that I will have a problem relative to parking, so we'll get there. But I think relative to, number of dwelling units in a building that otherwise conforms to the standards, that doesn't bother me.
And that is, as I started out, we're challenged to kind of separate the middle housing discussion that, I mean, I'm sure we're gonna be here within the next year or two talking about triplexes and quadplexes in that same lot that we're worried about an accessory dwelling unit. So this is kind of an interim step. This is our last ordinance under the last comprehensive plan before we kind of look at all of the rules around that. So yeah, I think this is a good illustration of the challenge that we've had trying to figure out what is an accessory dwelling unit in a potential middle housing future, but also recognizing that there was a reason for the limitations that we have now, and we're proposing to wipe away quite a few of them already. Which, so good, thank you.
Okay. So setbacks really are tied to height, so we spent a lot of time going through this to figure out what was the right formula and working with land use staff. So existing, if you have an alley lot, and I'm specifically referring to rear setbacks, there is no rear setback in an alley lot in those zones. For non-alley lots, though, in all of those zones, there is a 20-foot rear setback. So an ADU had to be set back 20 feet unless it was only 18 feet high, then it could be up to 5 feet from the rear yard line. So that's what we're starting with. The proposed is not to change the alley lots and again allow a minimum 5-foot setback when the ADU does not exceed 24 feet. And so 18 feet has been somewhat of a challenge for ADUs because it was referred to in the code as 1.5 stories, and so it has been somewhat awkward, and I certainly could ask the land use staff to talk about that too. And so we're proposing just to increase that to 24 feet.
Could you talk to me about those challenges? Because I'm thinking, if you have a building that's under 1,000 square feet and it's 24 feet tall, proportionally that seems like a very tall, thin building footprint. If you're, 500 square feet, that seems very awkward. And then you're pushing it up against your lot line, you know, you're putting this tall skinny building in somebody's backyard, your neighbor's backyard, not just your own. So what are the challenges with that 18-foot high building format?
I would say the most common one that we see is that, you know, a lot of times people want to have an accessory dwelling unit on top of a garage or a
Right.
workshop space. Right now, under the current code, it would not permit that at all. So I haven't seen anyone come in, even in an alley property that can go all the way up to that rear property line with a really small, thin, tall building, kind of what you're talking about. It's just not, at least it's not very common. I certainly suppose that it could come through. But in terms of what's being built, that's not typical. We're just usually seeing that they're not allowed to have any type of storage space, anything on that lower level on these non-alley properties, because 18 feet just doesn't support it.
I would not mind seeing some language about garages specifically, you know, because I think that would lend itself overall long-term to more proportional buildings being proposed. You know, I want to build a 24-foot tall building. You know, it's an ADU over a garage. You know, that's the formula. Otherwise, you know, you get a 1.5-story, 18-foot high standalone ADU. To just sort of describe it a little more completely, so that we are eliminating that tower from cropping up in the future. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, we'll look at that. In general, nobody's gonna, I think people prefer not stairs unless they have to, so that you wouldn't choose to make it tall and skinny, but there might be some situations of a lot size and shape, and
Yeah.
maybe that's the only room that you have. So we'll try to think again through some of those use cases and see.
I like that it allows for 2 stories, and 18 feet did not necessarily allow for that. So I think that's important. But I do have a question. If you can have 2 ADUs on your property and you can build 2 stories, could you potentially build 2 ADUs stacked on each other?
The way the code's written, proposed now, you probably could, yeah.
Thank you.
I have a question about the maximum height. Is that the maximum height of the structure, so to the tallest part of the roof, is that right?
Tallest part, should we go to the height slide? or
Yeah,
is there
so
kind of
that's why
intertwined?
the height and setbacks are intertwined, so in the setbacks, if we could just, I think it's the next one. So,
This, between heights and setbacks, this almost broke Becky and I, trying to figure out what it is existing because of these roof pitches and the setback, the height is different in the setback, and so anyways.
yeah, so here we've, so it would be to the top of the pitch, and, so we suggested that to eliminate a flat roof at 24 feet would be to not let the eaves exceed 18 inches. And so,
So I guess with that revision, does that mean if I wanted to build a shed roof, the top of the shed roof would need to be no taller than 18 feet?
accessory
The eve height.
building,
So we actually picked this up from another code, and it enabled us to avoid the pitch 4 to 12 and all of that was driving everybody crazy, I think, because people on the other side need to design these things and understand the rules, and we need to apply them. So it seemed like a lot cleaner to just you regulate the size of the box, the walls, and that's 18 feet.
but does this
And
apply to accessory buildings? Resident, is that what you're asking, that
My
like a
question was
shed?
relative to roof form. So if it's a shed roof, just a single plane on a slope, does that mean that the top of that slope needs to be no taller than 18 feet? because.
Right, I think the bottom of it would have to be 18 feet.
The
And
bottom.
the top of it could be the height for the zone, which is typically 28 feet. Would you call the one eve?
I would as well, but depending upon how it's detailed, it may be good to provide an example, I guess, when we do write the code.
I just want to clarify your question. So you were asking if you had like a lean-to style roof structure. My understanding was that the eaves 18 feet, but then I would assume you could not make up that kind of difference between 18 feet and 24 or potentially 28 with that style of roof. Is that permitted?
Something we should think about. That'd look pretty interesting.
It wouldn't it? Yeah.
What was going through my mind was how we would apply the roof pitch to shed roofs. Does that ever come up?
Yeah, it's come up a lot.
Do we just apply the same 45-degree angle to the shed?
Exactly. So I think right now it comes down less to the style and just more so verifying the half floors and things like that, which starts to get very complicated regardless of which style you're dealing with. And just makes it more difficult to apply. So it certainly comes up though, there's plenty of especially modern designs that use that style of roof and a lot of examples that look great, but right now, again, especially on non-alley lots, they wouldn't typically be allowed anyway because it gets too tall, so.
So we'll think about whether it would just be, if anyone would have abused that would seem like abuse to have that shape of a house, but I don't know modern design or what the next era of modern design might be. So that's a good one for us to look at.
Can we go back to the
Setbacks.
rear yard setback? So I remember the planning commission meeting when we had public testimony about the non-alley lot ADU that was problematic. Remember it well. And I think that we may be exacerbating the situation. Not that I think that's a common situation, but by requiring only a minimum of 5 feet setback from a non-alley lot and increasing the dwelling unit height to 24 feet, strikes me that there's possibly we're casting a greater shadow than we are currently under the code. And so understand the limitations of 18 feet. One possibility would be to increase the setback from 5 feet to something greater to accommodate for the additional height.
1 foot for every additional foot.
Something like that. I mean, that's the concept. I think that, she felt passionately about that, and we don't get a lot of public feedback in this forum, so I think we should probably at least take note of it.
Yeah, the rear setbacks are hard, the non-alley lots are hard because it is typically going to be up against or near somebody's fence in the backyard, whereas the alley lot is up against an alley. Anything that substantially increases the opportunity to build accessory dwelling units is going to bring them closer to their neighbors. And that's just going to be something that we're going to have to balance. So I think we're going to need to find the right, thread the needle in terms of being as protective of a open feel in your own backyard in certain zones, recognizing that many zones don't have that already, or many development patterns don't have that already, with the ability to build ADUs in lots where you couldn't fit it currently.
Yeah, I think Commissioner Zelinski's proposal, though, was, basically a choose-your-own-adventure type of proposal. If you want 18 feet and you want to get within 5 feet of the property line, that's okay. But if you want it taller, you need to move it back further.
Right.
That seems reasonable to me.
Now, to clarify, Commissioner Zelinski, are you saying 18 feet for the top of the structure, or are we talking about the eaves, the eave line?
Well, I was thinking the top of the structure, actually.
So that would disallow a two-story structure within 5
Within
feet?
Yes. You'd have to start stubbing it back into line. 5 foot is not much of a setback. It's a typical side yard setback.
Yeah,
And it doesn't disallow
I-
1.5.
Correct.
So, the
I-
standard plate height is like 7 or 8 feet, so then you
Right.
still have 10 feet to work with above that first floor.
Right.
Which is pretty significant.
it is. My understanding was that if a structure is 18 feet, that, yeah, a two-story is not really plausible. And I just felt it was important to open that up, because I think that, folks who might be considering building an ADU, that might be a factor for a lot of different reasons. So I guess that's just why I was seeking clarification on what you were proposing. Thank you.
I also think that the garage case that I think you're concerned about is much more common on the alley lots. You don't see the garage being stuck that far back from the street if it's a non-alley
Right.
lot.
Especially since the side yard setbacks are so narrow, you can't necessarily drive to your backyard from the street in most cases.
Right.
There's no space to get back there, so it wouldn't tend to be a garage situation.
Well, again, if someone wanted to build 2 ADUs and stack them, I don't see why we should disallow that.
They just have to step it back more. It's not being disallowed, it's just being required to be set back.
I understand, but when you start talking about setbacks, then you have to deal with lot size, and that means that there may be folks who have lots where that is not a possibility, where it is disallowed because of that additional, setbacks. So I just think that we have to try to balance the needs, I guess is what I'm saying. I don't necessarily know that I personally would just be clamoring for my neighbor to build a 24-foot structure that close. But I also think we have to really give property owners the right and the ability and the flexibility to do what is best for them. And it should not always be the neighbor's decision what that is. So I guess I'm thinking from that perspective. Thank you.
I would support that too. Like, we have massing, we have houses side by side that are of that equal on your neighbors. I mean, I think that's doable, and I think we need to look to be flexible and supportive of whatever we need to do to bring more housing. I have a question on the staff. Is there more examples of this happening though on a non-alley lot? Like
You mean like garage examples?
going up higher, people asking on that, I guess.
We've certainly had questions. I mean, right now, I would say we don't have concrete examples because it's not allowed. But we have questions about it frequently. And I would reiterate too, I mean, the minimum setback requirement, of course, is 5 feet. So there are several properties that are built, right up to that line. But we deal with a lot of non-alley lots that have wider space to actually access towards the back and would be interested in having garages, some that do just garages as well. So it does come up frequently too. Obviously not as frequently as an alley property, but that comes up.
Because there was another kind of principle we were working with. We allow detached residential accessory buildings. Do you know off the top of your head if there's a smaller setback for those in the rear?
It's the same either way.
Okay.
So they're both right now currently subject to 18 feet as the maximum height, whether it's a garage, shop, or an ADU. And they're also allowed to go up to 5 feet on non-alley properties. Both.
Okay. We're seeking to reduce the discrepancy between residential accessory buildings and residential accessory dwelling units, thinking that if you could build a garage shop, you should be able to build the same footprint within an accessory dwelling unit. So I think we'll work more on this and bring you back maybe some options, probably some more information. This is one of the most complicated and the most impactful, I think, of these. I say complicated because it brings in height, it brings in setbacks, it brings in different sizes and shapes of lots and different lot patterns and everything. So I think what I'm thinking of is having some examples of neighborhood patterns to look at and say, here's where the yards are and here's kind of what that might feel like. And then maybe some diagrams around some common lot sizes and what would it look like to have that kind of angled 1 foot setback, or what would it look like at the 5 foot, 24 foot, and we can go from there at the next meeting.
We're not done.
No, right, just on this one, yeah. Yeah. Was there anything else on height? And then I guess in the rest of the lot, right now it's limited to 24 feet, where any other building is limited to generally 28 feet in these zones. And so that would be a modest increase.
Parking. So there is one off-street parking space required for a unit, accessory dwelling unit. But there's some conditions that if you meet all of them currently, then you don't have to have a parking spot on site. You could see them there, not in a permit zone. That's a little bit problematic because some permit zones aren't actually implementing permits. You have to have frontage on a public street. You have to have 2 on-street parking spots in front of the primary unit or the accessory unit, and then you must be within a quarter mile of a public transit stop. The quarter mile, there is a state statute that says that we cannot require a parking spot for an ADU if it's within a half mile of a major transit stop.
Quarter mile, but yes.
Quarter mile, what did I say? Half mile. So that's why that's there. And in order to get that waived, you'd have to get it approved by the planning director. So the staff couldn't make that determination without adding to the process of going to the planning director. So the proposal is to continue with 1 off-street parking space per unit, but it could be reduced, which would make it 0, when either of the following are met: that there's no off-street parking within a quarter mile of a major transit stop.
Nope,
Right,
that's
not right.
it's written wrong.
Yeah,
That you are within a quarter
you
mile.
are within. No off-street parking if there are parking spaces, if parking spaces are not available within 1,000 feet of the unit, and that the administrative staff could make that determination.
That's what it's saying. It's saying there would be no off-street parking requirement within a quarter mile
Yeah,
of a major
yeah,
transit
yeah,
stop. And no off-street parking if there are parking spaces on street available
Yeah.
within 1,000 feet.
I don't know how I cut that back. So hopefully that makes sense. Parking.
So again, the state law, part of that, I think it was last year, 2 years ago, there was a state law that passed that prohibits cities from requiring a parking space, off-street parking space for an accessory dwelling units if you're within a quarter mile of a major transit stop. Major transit stop is defined as 5 hours of 15-minute service at peak hour. So that's, I think, most of our fixed route service within the city. So quarter mile actually covers quite a bit of the city. There was an out that we could, just for full disclosure, if the city had made changes to its accessory dwelling unit regulations 4 years, within the 4 years prior to that bill passing, then they could be exempt from that prohibition. But our proposal is to not use the loophole. It's not really a loophole, but but to take the suggestion at its face value. If you're not within a quarter mile, then you could also have your parking waived if there is on-street parking spaces available within 1,000 feet, which is like a 3-minute walk or something. So the 2 spaces in front thing, I think that seems difficult to interpret. What does in front mean? And does it matter that it's across the street and not right in front of your unit or something? So there you go.
So existing code is not compliant with state law anyway,
Correct, except for
that exception. Yeah, right, got it.
And reducing parking minimums for this would also be in accordance with what we agreed to in the housing action plan, from my
It
understanding.
was a recommended amendment, yes.
I think this makes a lot of sense. The challenge I'm having, besides reading that text, or I'm going to read this.
So sorry.
Yeah, I could read this aloud, we could all get really confused.
I was gonna try to rewrite it.
It's the, so the no off-street parking required if adequate on-street parking spaces are available within 1,000 feet of the subject property. That to me, it strikes me that's that is a lucky or unlucky situation for the property owner. Similar to if somebody wanted to build a 24-foot high ADU and they were uphill from their neighbor, right? They would cast a larger shadow on their neighbor than they otherwise would if it was a flat situation. We're not controlling for that, obviously, but we are controlling for parking. So I guess I would just say, encourage you to rethink how that operates, because it seems to me that we're not really equitably applying the cost of providing parking in this situation.
I had a similar thought to what Commissioner Finch had regarding the word adequate, because that is a word that, of course, can be subjective. So what defines adequate? And so I also, I went looking just a little bit for information about the impact of ADUs on parking, like actual data on it. And I was not able to find data that said, hey, we did this study and we found that ADUs had this negative impact on parking, and here's the result. So I would invite someone to share that type of information if it exists, because my understanding is that there is no information that says that ADUs present a parking problem to neighborhoods. So considering all of the goals that we went through when we started this discussion, why do we continue to require an off-street parking unit at all if we don't have any evidence that ADUs actually present a parking problem to communities? Why do we continue with that regulation?
Yeah, I concur with Commissioner Chatters. We do have data. We built 31 units in 2 years. I don't know if we're creating a parking problem like that. So I'm with you. I think that I don't see a significant threat to the city of Everett by loosening the parking requirements for ADUs.
Okay. We're trying to stay a little bit true to a long history of requiring abundant parking for every development and making that essentially the limiting factor on developments in the city. I think maybe a map would help, so I'll see if we can put that together for the next one. There is one place that I can think of where there is no on-street parking. I don't know that it's a place that an accessory dwelling unit would be built, but it was a development, the skate deck development on 19th, where we were working through the parking ratios. And if you don't have parking space in that development, you're going like a mile. There's no on-street parking and everything else is private property. You're not allowed to park there. And so presumably many people, I think two-thirds or so of households have vehicles or something, accessory dwelling units probably less so. But we're trying to avoid a situation where there's an obvious incentive for illegal parking in fire lanes or things like that. So there's a pretty few areas, maybe it should be written rather than an exception as in the narrow case in which you are far from transit and far from on-street parking, you need off-street parking. But we'll shop that one around a little bit more too.
My reaction is that if we're trying to sell these to single-family neighborhoods, we have to show we're being sensitive to one possible negative or adverse impact. We may or may not have any evidence that it's creating a problem, but I would suggest that we don't have enough sample of ADUs. They're dispersed around the city. As a class, we don't have enough experience with potential density of ADUs to know whether, as a class, they would create a parking problem or not. So I have no problem with continuing to require a parking space. But my one reaction is actually going in the other direction. The 1,000 feet seems kind of a big threshold to me, particularly if it's measured as the crow flies, because that could be 2 blocks away. And I would say that if somebody has potentially available on-street parking 2 blocks away, they're not going to consider it available. Particularly if accessory dwelling units are occupied by seniors, and a lot of them are, I would suspect. I don't know. Again, I don't know how much detail we have on who's occupying these ADUs, but
I think our intent was walking distance, but you're right, that's something that should be clarified. Adequate, we could probably take a close look at that. And I guess for your consideration is what a parking problem would be. So I am concerned about situations that would lead to safety issues like blocking fire lanes, and certainly there are developments that incentivize that and have created the conditions that almost force people to block sidewalks, if it's too short of a, parking spaces and all that. Outside of that, what a parking problem is that there's less on-street parking available on the street than there used to be. And I guess return to our balance, and ADUs are gonna be they're not gonna be so widespread as to change the game in terms of parking. Again, if we are going to achieve the goals that were set out in the housing action plan and the policies and everything that is coming before us, we're gonna have tougher conversations, I think, to have around parking than these, but this is an excellent case study for all of us. But I think Commissioner Zelinski, you're right about the public perception. That is usually top of mind for a big slice of the population. And if I frequently have parking space available in front of my house and I don't anymore, now that can happen just from your neighbor has 6 cars. There are those folks around. Yeah, exactly. So that can happen absent an EDU, but you could have the 6 cars plus an EDU bringing another 1 or 2 or something like that. But are those, does an existing resident have a right to the on-street parking, or is that the commons that if you really need to have parking, you should maybe have it on your own property? There are swaths of the city that were built before the automobile that have many houses that don't have parking, and we have residential parking permits to try to protect the general availability of parking in those areas. And we do have a standard in the public works side of things that requires new development to have all of the parking needs met on site, so that it is not chipping away at the available public parking for folks who have had a house that's 100 years old and never had a garage. But yeah, it's a tough issue. I don't think this is going to make or break it. Yeah, what is the value of the on-street parking availability compared to the housing affordability issue? And that's kind of what we're trying to balance here.
Would it be possible, when you come back and present this, to have a version of this that instead of 1 off-street space per unit, just no off-street spaces per unit, and instead make the exception being those circumstances where someone is far away from a transit stop and someone is far away from on-street parking?
Sure. Yeah, that would that would essentially do the same thing, but would be written differently, yeah. Yeah, and at some point in a couple of months, I guess we're gonna have to come down to some decisions on these things. So these are great points, and these are pointing at areas that we need to do some more homework on to support that discussion.
And if I recall correctly, there was a discussion earlier this year about changing the definition of single-family residence. I think we changed that definition to include unrelated people in the same house, and there's no maximum on that, so they could all be adults, all occupying a room, presumably all having cars. So to turn the screws on
Yeah.
ADUs and not on rooming houses does strike me as a little bit odd.
Okay. Next.
Yep. So this is, the proposal here is to remove the following design standards, which are most of them. There's a requirement there that there's appearance and character of the primary, or excuse me, principal dwelling. That is a very subjective thing for staff to decide and to determine. In a lot of cases, there's a lot of back and forth with an applicant. One of the restrictions is that you can only have one street side entrance. We've seen cases where that looked just fine. It was okay, and I actually have seen it just walking down the street. And so we're proposing to eliminate all of these standards, and that includes the requirement to match the siding and roofing and windows, the roof pitch of the primary dwelling unit. And then finally, there's something in the development regulations that requires the planning director to promulgate a design manual for ADUs. And typically, you wouldn't find that in a set of regulations, but more on a policy level. So we're suggesting that, not that it won't be done at some point, but that it shouldn't be in the development regulations, and that this is probably not a time that we have to accomplish this project.
Why would you remove the design standards?
Again, because they're subjective, and that the principal dwelling isn't always the example that you want the accessory dwelling unit to look like. So again, they're somewhat subjective and difficult to implement. I would let anybody else.
Yeah, we
weigh in.
talked a little bit about that back in March, that some of the issues were that you have many blocks where there is architectural variety, and so if this house looks different than that house and that house looks different than that house, why does that ADU need to look like that house? Also, maybe that house doesn't look good and you don't want to fit it. And then just generally making the option more available at a lower cost and with fewer obstacles was the rationale there.
I will always find value in architectural services, and I realize that I am biased there. I do think that appearance and character does seem very vague. A requirement for a design manual seems more labor intensive than necessary for staff. However, I think matching the ADU in overall quality and character to the existing structure sounds reasonable and very easy to quantify. And certainly entrances too seems, so street side entrance, that's not alley side though. So if you're on the alley, you're required to access the unit from the street and not the alley?
No, I think I can describe this by yeah, go ahead, Kelsey.
So there's a provision right now that talks about attached units can't, attached ADUs can't have two entrances facing the public street without undergoing a Rev 2 modification.
Okay.
We've only had one instance of that so far. It was where someone was just trying to convert an extra garage space into a new unit.
Sure.
We went out to notice, got no comments. So at this point anyway, the instances where it has come up hasn't proven to be an issue. It also is more, it's a more strenuous design requirement than what we would require on just a single-family residence. So right now, someone could build a single-family residence tomorrow without any ADU and have 3 entrances facing the street. We have nothing to say they can't do that.
Sure.
Versus under the current regulations for ADUs, it's a bit more restrictive. Similar to matching the siding and materials, there's no provisions or no permit requirements, at least for a single-family residence, to come in and obtain a permit to change out the siding. So trying to match some of those elements to a unit that could swap out the siding tomorrow doesn't always make sense either, because it's not something that we actually regulate or are able to track. So just trying to eliminate some of those things that pop up that we either don't have the means to track or isn't something that we deal with permitting anyway.
I do think there's a pitfall, though, in an accessory dwelling unit not being built to the same quality as a primary dwelling, and to eliminate, you know, some shoddy construction or just a really unsightly building, it would be nice to introduce some standards that prohibit, I don't know, T111 or something else that is prohibited elsewhere. So I cannot support eliminating design standards altogether.
How do these design standards for, especially the match siding, roofing, window siding, and roof pitch, how does that interact with some of our much older housing stock that may be already non-conforming?
We look for major, the roof pitch, you know, is fairly easy to get, and then otherwise, I think we mainly look for like horizontal slats versus vertical slats. So I mean, say you can't have vertical slats because the main house has horizontal slats. But if the main house has brick, would we require brick on the ADU? Maybe, I guess. So it's not, can you describe the level of detail? I mean, what I've seen has been at a very general level of detail. It's things like horizontal, vertical, but if the windows, you know, if it's old windows on the main house that have a cross, you know, but we don't make those windows much anymore. We wouldn't prohibit the design that had that.
Well, I think it kind of comes back to as well that, you know, depending on an existing unit and the windows they might have, if they're doing the same size, they could swap that out pretty easily without doing a permit as well. If they're increasing the size or changing things that actually, you know, lead to structural elements, then that requires permit. But there's just certain elements right now on these existing homes, whether they're brand new or, you know, were built in 1909, that they're able to swap in and out without us seeing it anyway. And so it's just kind of hard to track that information and make sure it matches.
Some of those older homes that you're talking about are in historic overlays too, and any changes there, you just submit your changes to the historic board and they review those things, but they're not all in the overlay, so.
I mean, I definitely think that design is something that people cite frequently, right? So anytime I've had the conversation with folks, we're happy to accommodate additional housing in my neighborhood just as long as it's well designed. We struggle with, I think everybody, I would love to hear some ideas on how to define that. We do prohibit T111 siding on buildings. Is that only the MU zone? Or is that city? So we have some things like that.
I don't know, Dan.
Presumably, I think it's in the MU zone or it's on pedestrian designated streets or something like that. So we do have some examples where we prohibit shoddy siding. In general, people are going to want to uphold the property value, and so they're going to want to you know, I guess balance value with good appearances. But the other aspects of design that are, one example that that I come back to a lot is pitched roofs. You know, personal preference to me, if it's a residential, it has a pitched roof, and if it's a flat roof, that's a commercial building. And I'm not a big fan of the modern style of box building. But that's not something that we regulate, and that's not something that we get into if you're building a new house or a townhouse. And so you'll have a row of houses that have pitched roof, and then in the middle of them, we'll have the one new one that is just, it's got a square. It's not my preference, but my mother loves them. And so do we, you know, how we get into that design world, you're right, it's much easier in the historic district, and we have the design guidelines, and maybe there is something to that idea that was in code to have a design manual that can be a little bit more nuanced and flexible. And just because we're proposing to remove it from code doesn't mean that we couldn't go down that path and start to come up with some characteristics of quality design. But we're challenged, but we do know that this doesn't work great, what we have now, just because the matching, in most cases, if you match one, then you're not matching the others.
Well, in your scenario with I mean, that doesn't speak to shoddiness. It's just a different
Right.
style, right? And certainly in my neighborhood, living in a house from 1909, I mean, what I love about my community is that each house is different, and there are new houses, I mean. And so the fact that a separate ADU in the back being different, I would support that. And I think the simplicity of this would be incredibly helpful in the affordability.
I concur.
I loved it because I tend to be a regulatory minimalist unless we're dealing with health and safety, those types of issues. But I think that Commissioner McGinn raises a really important point about quality. And so I assume that there are quality standards across anything that's constructed that would also apply to ADUs in a relatively similar manner. Is that correct?
Building code? But not really, no.
Yeah, it just would be building code. I mean, even the T111, it's not prohibited for single-family residences right now either, even though I would tend to agree with you. It's not something that we would encourage, but I also, at least in my experience of what we've been processing so far, it's not a common material that I've seen on these ADUs. Doesn't mean that they couldn't come in and propose it, but yeah.
So then I guess that leads me to my next thought, which is why would we have additional design and style regulations on ADUs that we do not subject other housing forms to, like just the principal dwelling? Why would we impose greater, more stringent standards on an ADU, and isn't that really kind of negating our whole purpose in making these more accessible and increasing our housing stock? So thank you. I love removing regulations if they do not need to be there. But I do think that Commissioner McGinn has a good point.
I think the purpose of these standards was to sort of tie together the accessory unit with the principal house, not necessarily to regulate quality, which is a difficult thing to regulate anyway, but just to draw a tie between the two. And so to me, there's ways to do that are fairly simple, and providing flexibility to the builder. If he's building this is for detached units, who pick a feature from the main building and reflect it in the new one, and it can be your roof pitch, it could be the roof color, it could be the color of the siding, it could be the material. Pick one thing. That provides a lot of flexibility. It's relatively easy to do, and it, at least for the time being, creates the tie. Obviously, these materials can be swapped out later, but at least if you're gonna require it of a new building going in, the ADU is a new building going in, it's not gonna be swapped out anytime soon, and it creates that link initially. So I don't have a problem with doing that.
Any feedback from experience on that? Kelsey, Steve? Would that, because there could be room for something that's in between jettisoning it completely, and what we have right now is a standard that shall visually match. Siding, roofing, windows, and building trim materials shall visually match those used on the principal dwelling. That's a pretty high standard. We have not been able to get to that. So it could be
You could do
something-
less than that and still
Right.
achieve some measure of the original intent, which is to draw that connection between the detached unit and the principal dwelling.
I guess my only comment would be that, you know, I think when we talk about this, there's this idealized vision of what the principal residence looks like. And I'm sure there are a number of lots that are very suitable for an ADU that you would not want to carry over any of the design language to a new structure. And so how do you create the flexibility to build something that's actually better than the principal structure that was there originally?
Okay, we'll brainstorm some maybe middle ground and test that out. I think, you know, I do hear design a lot, and this needs to be well received, because this is yeah, we want to build a quality city and quality neighborhoods, but at the same time streamline everything. We want it all. Abundant parking, cheap costs, big houses, cheap rents.
I have a quick question. So when we had this discussion previously, we talked about those, the plans that would be pre-approved, the design plans that would be pre-approved. Are we scrapping that, or is that something that's still in the works? And maybe that could somehow tie into this type of situation where if it's outside of this parameter, maybe it needs a closer look, but absent that, we can disregard the design standard portion that was previously in the code.
That's coming on another slide or two.
Oh. Let me be patient.
Yeah, here we go.
And this is the
This
last one.
Yeah. So finally, we're proposing to eliminate the requirement for owner occupancy. And that's required in RS, R1, and R2 zones. Also because we've really narrowed down the requirements that would be there in the proposal, we wouldn't want to modify, such as the height, the setback, unless you went through a variance like any other project would go through. But we've created flexibility in the code itself as opposed to having to use a modification process, which just adds to timing. And then finally, not as part of this proposal, but that we would recommend exploring a pre-approved ADU program. I think you met Jennifer Gregerson last meeting, and she's our housing project manager or housing expert, and so that would be something that she could take forward, but not as part of the code amendment, but something we don't want to drop, because we are getting some feedback that people think this is a good idea, and it's really not for, it's kind of for the one-offs that really need to help and save money, and then, the city gets a unit out of it.
Sorry, I was looking at front porch and entrance requirements. There's more to come on that design piece, I think, for next time. Did you mention lot segregation?
Oh, no, it wasn't on the slides, but in the,
It's in the memo, too.
yeah, it's,
Dropping the restriction on lot segregation.
so on the number of units, there was a provision that said you could not segregate the property. Right now, if that was dropped, then someone could, well, in order to subdivide, they'd have to meet all the other subdivision regulations. But there's discussion about a potential for a condo situation. So condominiumizing a unit, which could create ownership opportunities within the community.
So we talked about that, I believe, in March when we initially visited this subject. I think that's an interesting area to pursue and to provide. It does have some interplay with parking, however, because if you create a separate legal lot or a condominium, and we're not requiring a parking stall, but we are for a single-family residence, there is that odd juxtaposition
Yeah.
there. So it's something to consider, I think, as you move forward.
Yeah.
I think last time we talked about odd-shaped or very small lots, but Becky makes a good point that you would have to meet the minimum depth, width, and all of that to short plat it. But you could condo it off and sell a little ADU. That's all we got.
Ms. McCrary, any more?
That's it.
Great, thank you for your
We had a lot of-
presentation tonight.
Thank you.
you all.
Thank you for your feedback.
Any additional commissioner comments? Yes, Commissioner Zelinski.
Yeah, so on the question of allowing two ADUs, I have a little hesitation about two detached ADUs on a lot with a single-family home on it, just from the standpoint of the neighborhood character that we want to preserve. I mean, if one were attached and one were detached, I wouldn't have a problem, but two detached units on a single-family home, I have a little hesitation about that myself. This may be a minority position here, but
Do you think that the lot coverage, though, would probably eliminate one?
I'm thinking of neighborhood character. Well, if the lot is sufficiently large, it wouldn't be a problem. Then you get into, well, what's sufficiently large? And maybe the lot coverage would cover that situation, but it'd be worth looking at to make sure that that's the case.
Great. I have nothing more.
Any public comments tonight on this matter? Okay. Seeing none? Okay, we're adjourned. Thank you.